Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Test Tubes and Cauldrons, a podcast where we talk about the intersection of science and spirituality. So, because everybody really enjoyed the spiritual shower thoughts episode we did a couple of weeks ago, actually, it might have been a month ago, but now I don't even know. Time does not exist. We decided to do a second one. So, this is the second spiritual shower thoughts episode. Thank you to people who offered their suggestions on our IG page. We really appreciate it. If you want to have input in this in the future, please follow us on IG. We do typically put out a kind of feeler for a place for you to submit any spiritual shower thoughts that you have for us to give our opinions on. But before we get into our weird takes, I'm going to pass it over to Fel, who has our What Happened on This Day.
Alrighty, so on this day, Jules Jean-Baptiste Vincent Baudet, somewhere a French person just correct, who was born on June 13th, 1870, was a Belgian bacteriologist and immunologist who discovered the complement, a complex of proteins in the blood that causes the destruction of foreign cells in an immune response. He also isolated the bacterium responsible for whooping cough, for which he later developed a vaccine, which is very pertinent right now. Good for him.
It's actually a really good vaccine as well, except in New Zealand, apparently they have really bad issues with whooping cough. I'm not quite sure why, but yeah, it's really interesting how it's like quite localized.
Cool. Well, let's pop into it then. Creatures who have shown high intelligence and rituals. So monkeys, ravens, do we think that they have higher powers?
The silence in this chat right now. I kind of came to this idea because basically I think a lot of magical stuff is like very heavily anthropomorphic, but then we've got this idea of animism, which kind of seems to go against that. And we know from science that many kind of higher order creatures show quite a high level of intellect. For example, crows can plan, they can plan ahead. There's a really wonderful woman called Professor Nicola Clayton, who I was lucky enough to see a seminar for. And she was saying that crows have a similar level of intellect to like a young child because they have that kind of level of foresight. So I guess I wanted to pose the idea, like, if they have that ability to plan, then do they have the ability to access magical powers? Do they have the ability to kind of interface with the divine, or is it purely a human thing?
That's a good question too, because ravens have been shown to hold like a congress. I don't even know what the hell they do with their congress. Probably more productive than the American Congress. But they'll they have different languages too. Like you'll notice ravens specifically from different parts of the world can't understand each other verbally because they have different accents. So
that's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say because I feel like, because we are so human centric, we often view animals as being lesser. And then I suppose it kind of gets into like a weird animist perspective of things, of like, is there a higher spirit inside of the animal? You know, people always joke, like, my cat's talking to the ghost or my cat's looking at the ghost. There's kind of this idea that we have, at least in a lot of cultures, that this idea that animals, because they're more primal, have a deeper access to spirit. So there could be something to that. Now, I think what's interesting about this question is because it's not just like, can they interact with it? It's like, but almost like, can they practice religion consciously? Whereas I kind of view animals as a very liminal thing in a lot of ways, kind of sometimes straddling the more than human world. But this idea of being with higher intelligence, like ravens, crows, or now I'm thinking about octopi.
Maybe even like elephants, because they show that they have grieving rituals for their dead. So there are some kind of rituals which are parallel to what we see in human populations, but can we kind of carry that over the whole way?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. I'm inclined to say no, but I do think that animals, they're more in tune to their senses because to them, their senses are more important for survival, right? So in that way, they might seem maybe a little bit more spiritual, like the whole cats seeing ghosts thing, all of that. Or really any kind of like rituals that these animals might have. It's more a method of survival. And I don't know, like that's the thing. I think they do have intelligence and that can be used for some things, and I do think it leads to some very interesting phenomena you probably could use in spirituality. However, I don't think that any animal has the same like the intelligence to the point that humans do in terms of being able to like practice or follow a religion. I feel like most of their like rituals are more out of necessity. This idea of evolution really more than anything like spiritually based. But you know, you could also make the argument like I haven't actually looked into this, so I can't speak for sure, but it would be interesting to see if maybe some of the animals that are associated with a lot of the different gods and goddesses of different pantheons maybe have higher than, you know, quote unquote normal intelligence for other animals like ravens, or like ravens are associated with Odin, I think, among, you know, and a couple other deities. And so I'd be curious to see if maybe some of the common like animal associations, like foxes, I think are also an animal that's commonly associated with some deities, and they're also considered to be of high intelligence. So is that the case for maybe all of the animals that are associated with the divine? And if so, is there a reason for that? Could be something interesting to consider and look into.
I kind of get tied up on this because I think from an animist perspective, there is definitely a level of spirituality inherent to every creature. So from that sense, I believe it. But then if I look from a more scientific perspective, I think about the level of intellect we can see in crows, for example, and we see that it's equivalent to, say, that of a young child. Now, I think of a young child trying to do magical or ritual, and then that kind of analogy starts to break down. But the way I can explain that is maybe the types of systems are just something so foreign to us as humans that it's not something that we can understand. Or like you say, it's more survival based, it's more primal, and so it's not something that we can kind of relate to, especially because so many magical systems are so based on kind of these anthropomorphic human concepts. Even the divine feminine and masculine, you could argue, are very human centric when that concept doesn't apply equally across the animal kingdom.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up children, because I think children they're fascinating to observe, and like some of my own recollections of being a child. But I mean, from what I've observed of children, they're just constant myth makers, you know? And a lot of kids believe in magic of some degree. Like, I remember I worked with a lot of preschool kids, and they would like have magic wands and like be casting spells. Definitely it wasn't to the same like theoretical, for those who can't see me, obviously I put casting spells in quotes. Now obviously children don't have the same like philosophical level as adults do, but you know, children when they're of a certain age can, even when they're very young, can like conceptualize of gods or of God. I mean, I was a pretty religious 5-year-old. And I think they can't conceptualize it in the same way as adults do. I don't know. I think even if we're looking at children, children can believe in gods. And like the amount of times I've spoken to a child, like one time I was talking to a preschooler, they were like, you need to come into the classroom, there's a ghost. And they were like trying to exorcise the ghost of this classroom. And I was like, what is happening? And these are preschoolers. So like, that's like 4 or 5, or at least where the school that I was working at. So 4 or 5-year-olds were doing levels of ritual. So I think there is something to that. But I think, yeah, the ritual would not necessarily look like how we as adults conceptualize of it. I mean, I remember when I was young, I asked my dad once, I was like, if aliens exist, do they believe in the Christian God? Because I was like hung up on this idea of like the Christian God's the only true God. And I was like, would aliens have to believe in this God? And my dad was just like, why? Why are you asking me this question? But that's another interesting idea, because a lot of our own beliefs are, as you said, like very human centric, which is why I, as a kid, got hung up on this idea of if aliens would believe in Jesus, because they're aliens. They're not humans. Yeah, so I mean that's a whole other shower thought, but
Yeah, I mean, I think like I do think that children are capable of magic simply on the basis of that they are limitless in their thinking. And so nothing is truly impossible to them, which means that their capabilities of like, because that's one of the things we talk about sometimes within our own communities. It's like the only limits that you have in magic are the limits that you put upon yourself. When you transcend those, then your opportunities are, you know, open much more widely. And so children haven't necessarily learned the rules of society, and so when they think about things, they don't think about them within the limits that are typically, you know, surrounding maybe more adult behavior and thought. So in that way, I do think that in many ways children are very much so capable of magic, although in a less defined manner, as Fel pointed out. I think thing that we need to kind of differentiate between like with crows and children is when we're talking about intelligence, what are we referring to? Because there's like simple recognition and then fitting back of a behavior, right? Like I think, what is it, a parakeet that like you say something and it spits right back at you, like that kind of thing. So is it more of like a recognition type of mechanism that we're calling intelligence, or is it something more? Because I think there's a difference between intelligence and cognizance, or an understanding, like a true conceptual understanding of what's happening, like these higher kind of ideas. I think that's really the important distinction to have there.
That's a really good point. I actually wish I'd made more notes on this before our episode, because Professor Clayton has some really interesting ideas on this. Her work is centered around problem solving and basically comparing toddlers and crows, which sounds like a fascinating job. But I think the key findings from her work were really that crows have this sense of time and ability to plan forward. And that's something that we don't necessarily see in other creatures. It's only one aspect of intelligence, but this kind of problem solving and kind of object permanence, which we don't necessarily see. And I think that is kind of essential for when you're doing kind of a magical working, obviously, because you have to think about the future. And a lot of animals are kind of primal enough that they're kind of living in the now, if that makes sense. They're kind of responding to instinct, whereas things like crows are not necessarily doing that all the time.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Again, I personally am very skeptic of this idea, but I think I'm like the least animistic out of all of us. I just think that in regards of like the time and the planning thing, like that's also just a survival mechanism. Like the time makes sense because they're birds, right? So I don't know. I don't know anything about crows. I am not an ecologist. Okay, my dealings are with things that are smaller than what's observable. But like if they are a migratory bird, then the whole planning or like being time sensitive makes sense, like knowing when to move to what places. So to me, it's more just like a survival thing that probably evolved over time, this sense of knowing. But it is, again, like it is possible that there is some kind of like more divine connection that we just aren't aware of. And if you have like an animistic mindset, I can definitely see where that connection would be drawn for sure.
I guess my follow-up question would be, so like crows also have the ability to create an economy. There's fascinating observations of crows trading with one another, and like we have no idea how they make decisions or what their economy is based on, but they do have some sort of bartering, like a economic bartering system, which is interesting. Because then my follow-up question to you, Astra, would be, well, then what sets us apart from animals? And I know that's like there's a lot of like, oh, it's obvious, but when does the point become it's just, because one could argue a lot of things that humans do are just survival skills that have gone into the microcosm. I mean, like wanting to be accepted by a community is a survival skill. Wanting to control something is a survival skill. So my question would be, when does that bleed into like ritual and religion and out of survival, you know?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the key is recognition, and let me explain that. What I mean by that. So if we did do things that were simply for survival, like we would know that and we would be okay with that if we weren't aware that perhaps there's something more. I think that's where the biggest difference is, that humans, we long for a connection, for something more, for a connection with the divine, like we touched upon in our Built for Divinity episode. And I think like a recognition of that element is probably what puts humans maybe above or like on a separate kind of plane than animals. Not to say that we're necessarily better, because like plants and animals do some wacko stuff that's like I wish we could do. But I think it's like that recognition of the fact that like there is something bigger, kind of outside of our physical day-to-day like life, that we are aware of, that maybe animals are not. Although we can't say for sure, right? Because we don't know what animals are or aren't aware of, because we're not animals. And we are, but not like, you know what I mean? That's what I would argue the difference is, but I don't know. To be totally honest, I didn't come prepared for a philosophical discussion.
I think we should do an episode on religion in animals. It would be a good episode, I think, to do like more on religion in other species to see like how prevalent this is, because I feel like it's a lot deeper than maybe we originally thought.
Yeah, that maybe, yeah. That could be a whole thing. We could do a whole episode on that. Yeah. Especially when you look at like rituals of other animals, like elephants, like we were talking about. I don't know.
That'd be a fun episode. We should
Something
do that.
to think about. It gives you more time to think of an answer.
There you go. Maybe I'll change my mind. Who knows?
Yeah.
So the next one, this is kind of funny. I giggled when I saw it. And it's what happens if you eat a binding spell.
So this was related to when I was making a smoothie and I accidentally got something else from my freezer into my smoothie. Um, and it just prompted the thought, like, what, because people use those freezer binding spells. If you're not familiar with these, this is when you put, I think often like a petition with the person's name on, for example, whatever other correspondences, and then you put that in the freezer. And the idea is that you're freezing out the person and you're neutralizing the effect of against them. So basically, if you eat that, like, are you taking in that effect? And there was a related question that somebody contributed, which was, if someone made eclipse water and tricked someone else into drinking it without them knowing, A, what would happen to them? And B, if something bad did happen to them, does it count as a hex? I have no intention of doing this, but I have been wondering about it. So I guess the kind of general overarching question is like, how much does the intent matter? And like, what effect does ingesting something like that have?
So there's a couple things I was thinking about. First of all, if like when you eat something, it leaves your system eventually through the excretion process. And at that point, then another question is like, is the spell still in effect or has it done its job and is it finished? Which is curious. That might be really useful for a hex. Like, so I don't really know if I want like a hex going through my body. Anyways, yeah. So when you eat a binding spell, in a way, I kind of think it could be. There's a couple of thoughts that come to mind. One is like the binding spell inside of you. Not that I would recommend anybody eating paper or anything, but like whatever. Like when you put it inside of you, in a way, like because it is in your body, like you are asserting dominance over that individual and kind of in a way surrounding that binding spell with your will in a very like physical manner. And so because of that, you could think of it a lot like dominance over the will of this other person, and essentially stopping their action. And you could consider it to amplify the spell's energy. And the other thought is something about like the layers through which it has to travel. So for instance, like inside you, and you could think about this on a more macro level, or you could even get super microscopic, where like as you digest it, this energy kind of gets distributed through your body and the different ways the cells take up nutrients and whatever. And so the spell kind of takes on like a larger form in essence and becomes like a part of you. So the binding spell, for instance, like if you were to include some kind of nutrition with the binding spell, like those nutrients are a part of your body and they'll be used to produce like ATP and other things like cellular energy. And so you could also think of it in terms of like leeching, right? So this binding spell not only is it's essentially taking the energy away from the person to like for them to do a particular action, like a constant kind of leeching. But then that begs the question, how long does that last? Is it only until you excrete the remainder of the spell, and like how would you know when that is, and so on and so forth. That's kind of where my mind goes, but curious to hear other thoughts.
It's hard because, like, I mean, I've definitely heard or read stories of people talking about, like, accidental self-hexing. I don't know how much I actually believe in it versus how much of it is just my OCD being like, you've hexed yourself. Which is why, like, sometimes if I do painful workings, I'm always just, like, super paranoid. I'm like, what if a drop of this got on my porch? It's gonna be there forever. I don't know why that's my hexing voice.
It was very Boston, actually. Very, very
Yeah,
Boston.
well, so I don't know how much I genuinely believe that. It's hard to sort of disentangle that sort of like obsessive thoughts about it. If I was in that situation, I guess that's a good way to put how I might look at this. If I were in that situation and I knew I accidentally ate a binding spell, I would probably like do an uncrossing or whatever for myself and be like, well, it's better safe than sorry. Now, how it would manifest if I didn't know that I ate it or whatever, that's a different story. I don't know.
I do think, yeah, like if it was unintentional, then I would do the same. I would like do an uncrossing and, like take care of it, or even just try and dismantle the spell if I had remnants and could do so. But like I think it would depend. Like if I ate it accidentally, I don't really, that's interesting because then I don't know if maybe, yeah, because like my examples from earlier, I kind of like, those are things that I would maybe, if it happened accidentally, I could maybe go back and like readjust the spell to do maybe something different if I realized I accidentally ate it. Or even like you could make something with the intention of eating it and have those kind of be like your ultimate goals. Yeah, it's a weird thought. I don't know. Like would it, if it's meant to bind somebody else and you ate it, would it actually do you any harm?
But would it, if it unfreezes in your stomach, does it then unbind? Do you see what I mean?
Mm.
Or then if their name is digested by your stomach acid, are you causing them harm? Like it's just a weird, like it's a weird thought, right? Like what's going on during that process? Is there kind of any mechanism there, or does it just not matter because it's accidental and therefore you're not putting that intent into it?
I mean, if we're thinking about like stomach acid dissolving like paper, I mean, it.
You go into work and your co-workers like their faces like
I'm just thinking like.
heavily exfoliated.
But like, if you think about it in terms of like stomach acid, right? Like, yeah, the ice or whatever you froze it in might melt, but at the same time, like the paper would be destructed by the stomach acid. So like, isn't kind of the same thing happening in a sense? I don't know that maybe the destruction would mean that the spell is null, and so then nothing would happen anymore. I think that would kind of depend on what you, again, whether you designed it to be eaten or not.
What do you guys think about the eclipse water example? So basically, with this assumes that eclipse water is somehow evil and unpleasant stuff, which I don't personally believe. But let's just work off that assumption. And if somebody accidentally drinks it, do you think that has the same effect?
I mean, at that point, are you so you're tricking them into drinking it?
Yeah, for some reason you're doing that, and maybe it's like an evil experiment. I don't know.
I don't see how that would be any different than a hex, in my personal opinion. If you're tricking someone into drinking eclipse water for a specific purpose, I would see it as similar to like a hex or a jinx. I don't think it would be something like super intense.
I would probably see it more as a jinx, just because like, I mean, I'm just trying to think, like, if you were trying to trick somebody into drinking eclipse water, like, why would you do that? My thoughts are, like, when an eclipse happens, the sun is essentially blocked out. So perhaps you're trying to, like, block them from their power for a time, or, like, maybe block, like, good emotions for a time, I mean, whatever the intent might be. And if that's the case, then, like, it certainly is a jinx or a hex, depending upon the severity of the spell that you're trying to do with it. I think if they accidentally drink it, like, I don't know that would really do anything. You also have the question of, like, if they don't believe in it, then will it do anything to them? Yeah, I don't know. The whole idea of like planetary waters is something that I really struggle with, because I don't know that, like, that is something that to me is so easily affected by placebo effect, like so easily. And so I really am not convinced whether or not it actually has an effect on anything. But yeah, I mean, I would see it as probably like a jinx / hex, depending upon what you were trying to use it for.
Yeah, I think the original question is really interesting because it implies like a morally ambiguous outcome, like you, as if you're giving somebody the water to test the results, so you don't know if it's going to be a hex or not. So it's almost like saying, is it a hex if you don't know for sure that there's going to be a negative outcome?
It's like
And
a blind experiment, a single blind experiment, right?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I still think that that is morally kind of on the darker side of grey because you know that something bad could happen to them and therefore it's still hex-ish. Maybe
I mean,
jinx.
unless you
So
intended to do it, like your intention is to hex, and if it didn't work, then you would just go to something else. Like that's what I would do if I were
yeah,
going
like
to
using other
do an
people as your
experiment.
guinea
I'd be
pigs
like,
is not really
"Oh,
cool.
I want to hex you. So, like, let's just try this first, and if this doesn't work, then I'll go off and do something else. Do something a little more powerful." Yeah. Okay. Next question: can a song be an audio sigil? I mean, yeah, I think so. This isn't necessarily a sigil example, but I do know I was recently rereading Jason Miller's Elements of Spellcasting, I think is what it's called. What is it? Spellcrafting, sorry. And one of the keys that he has is something where he had like a neighbor who was being super loud, and he listened to a particular song and just like standing outside, and like let the emotions that it invoked be like the fuel for the spell. And like there was no candle, like nothing. It was just the song and the emotions that it invoked. So in a way, like yes, I do think that you could have an audio sigil and it would be effective. I don't really know why not. You could even consider like, is a ringtone an audio sigil? Like I don't know. What if you had like a sigil for communication that was your ringtone? So every time you answer the phone, the desire for like a flow of good conversation was always like the start of the conversation. I think it's actually a very brilliant idea.
But then how would you design such a sigil? Like, would it be based on like the waveform pattern or would it be kind of more similar to like a mantra or something like that? I know last week we talked about Musica Universalis and Fel gave us a really good explanation of that. Like how would you design such a sigil?
Yeah, I mean that would certainly be a good way to do it. I think if you really wanted to like draw down the energies associated with a particular planet, deity, whatever you're working with. I don't know. Felt, do you have any thoughts?
I mean, designing by waveform would be very interesting. Or you could do like the shape of the note. I don't know. I guess my question would be, what would be the purpose of the sigil? Because, like, in my mind, sigils are kind of not a one and done thing. That's not exactly what I mean. But it's like, a lot of people talk about like a lot of the power of the sigils in the releasing of the sigil or the destruction of the sigil. And so it's like you put power into drawing the sigil and then you burn it or whatever. So I guess I would be curious as to how that would look with an audio form. Like, would it basically, in my mind, then it's almost more like a word of power or like a chant than it is like a sigil.
I'm trying to think, what if you, because like there are things like amulets and talismans where like this sigil isn't just like burned and done, like something that you would carry around with you for a continuous length of time. It might be interesting if you designed a sound, maybe based on notes associated with, whatever, and then based your like connected the notes in some form, and like that was the basis of your sigil, which has like the musical essentially melody within it, and then you could also like have the sound as well to just like build correspondence upon each other. It is, yeah, it's an interesting idea.
The idea of audio sigils in terms of like full songs actually fully scares me because it kind of opens up the sort of conspiratorial ideas of, people playing messages over the radio and the songs on the radio with sigils, etc., etc. Which I mean, I think that's obviously conspiracy theory, but I think it can wade into that territory quite quickly. I'm gonna profess I don't know a ton about sigils, so I think that in theory, yes, possible, but my understanding behind them is not really well fleshed out enough to give a good answer. I do think Phil had a really good point that, yeah, a lot of the time I've seen people say that they kind of make the sigil and then almost forget about it and kind of let it do its work. And music is inherently catchy, right? Like it sticks in your brain. It's good in a way, like a mantra that you kind of you memorize so much that it almost becomes a part of you and you can sort of say it in your sleep. It's the opposite of that, right? It's you're constantly remembering it, and it's worming its way into you. So yeah, I'm not sure that I would call that a sigil, but maybe I am just fundamentally misunderstanding the concept.
Yeah, I guess for me, I wouldn't call it a sigil. I would, like I said earlier, I would call it like a word of power or some sort of chant. I mean, because I have done like temporary songs before where I like enter a state of trance, let a song come out, and then I don't record it or I don't write it down, and it's gone. It's usually leaves my brain. But then I don't see how that would be different than like a normal like rhyming or chant type thing. I would say if you're like looking and like sitting down and writing down a piece of music and you're connecting it somehow kind of like a sigil, I could see that being like charging the sigil whatever audio through an audio way. I think that could make sense. I mean, that could be cool. Like take a sheet of music and like do different points and then like connect them. I don't know. That could be interesting. So that I would consider more of a sigil, but then again, there is still like a visual aspect to it.
Yeah, I think that's maybe the key point, that I like it would have to be a symbol of some kind, whether that be through connecting the notes or maybe through something else. And then yeah, you could maybe charge it with the music or do
Right.
the thing with the ringtone where maybe like the sigil is, I don't know, like the screensaver on your phone, like the photo on your phone, and then like your ringtone is related to the sigil, and so like that's like doubling the
Right.
correspondence. That's kind of how I would see it work, like if it were to work at all. But I do think if you take the sigil aspect out of it, like the design of a symbolic representation of something, then it doesn't become a symbol, or as not a symbol. It is a symbol. If you take away the sigil itself, then it's no longer in that symbolic ideology of a thought or a desire and intention. Then it no longer is a sigil; it's turning into something else. I do agree with that point.
Another thought I just had, so there in medieval music theory is called the Guidonian hand. For those, obviously this is an audio medium, so people won't be able to see me. But basically what you do is you hold a hand up and you sort of like touch, it's a way that people learn sight singing. So you touch each part of your hand and each part of your hand represents a different note. So I could see that sort of becoming, like you're touching your thumb, then you're touching your pinky, you touch your pointer, and suddenly it's like a shape. So I could see that almost working as a sort of sigil. But again, there's a visual aspect to it. But
Not gonna
that's
lie,
kind of cool.
I totally was like watching you do that and thinking like, oh, we're just like dialing into the gods or something.
Yeah. So that's actually an interesting idea. Maybe I'll have to experiment with the Guidonian hand.
What it very much reminded me of actually is I had some friends actually over in the US, and they used to do sign language for a choir. And the movement you were doing, obviously you can't see Fel, but the movement you were doing very much looked like the sign language that they would do for deaf individuals who would attend to listen to the religious music. So that's kind of interesting, actually. I wonder if there's kind of some parallels there.
All right, so the next one.
Okay, so the question I had was, does the astral plane have genius loci? There was a discussion we were having the other day about genius loci. So the idea is that they are spirits of place. And what does that of place mean? And if we imagine the astral realm as somewhere that is kind of divorced from our physical earthly reality, is it possible to have a genius loci? Is there a singular location, or is it so lacking in physicality that you can't have a spirit tied to a particular location there? And I'm going to preface this with saying that my knowledge of astral is pretty limited, so I would like to hear your thoughts.
So when I was a wee baby practitioner, I did a lot of like astral projection. I put that in quotes for a reason. And my understanding after floating around the depths of Tumblr was this idea that there are different spirits that inhabit different parts of the astral plane, but I wouldn't count them as genius loci. Now, to go off of this, I don't really believe in astral projection anymore. I used to be a very wholehearted believer in it. Now I don't really believe that it's a literal thing. I more believe in like inner trance work. So that's my stance on astral projection in general. But my understanding from what I saw in the community who was like really into astral projection, like the energy work community or whatever, I don't know if there is a genius loci of the astral realm because the whole thing is kind of like a spirit of place, if that makes sense. Because I feel like a spirit of a place makes sense in a mundane world where there's kind of like a liminality, but I don't know if it makes sense in a place that's like there is no mundane aspect at all to the astral plane.
Okay, I'm with Phil here in regards to the astral realm. I don't really fully agree with this idea that it like truly is like a separate realm that you can travel to. I think that might be taking things a little bit too literally. However, I will say that I do think that there is kind of a liminal space between the physical realm and the spiritual realm. And if we're thinking about kind of this liminal space, and I do think that there are genius loci maybe within that plane of existence, realm, liminal region, whatever you want to call it. But I think when we get into like more of the spiritual realm, I don't necessarily think there are genius loci, just because I think it's a couple of things. First is that like it doesn't matter where you are, it seems like people have access to every spirit, generally speaking, unless you're like, not initiated into a tradition and all of that. And two, I don't think it makes sense. Like, I don't know what would hold them in one particular place, in a realm that is mostly spiritual and has no kind of like material, thing to keep them in an area, kind of like Fel was saying. So I do think, like, if we're talking in the liminal plane, yeah, I do think genius loci can be a thing. If we're talking more of like in the fully spiritual realm, I don't think that it's a thing there.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you guys. I think of it as spirits that are kind of inhabiting both realms. They're kind of rooted, if you like, in the physical realm. So there's that kind of earthly tie, and therefore I can't really understand how that tie would manifest in like a purely spiritual sense. Like, I guess I think of the earth as being quite grounding and um, yeah, rooting and tying something down. And I just in the most basic of ways, the concept of a genius loci in my mind doesn't really translate to a purely kind of celestial being. But that might just be my misunderstanding of it. I know that some people believe that when you pass on, your body kind of goes to the astral, whatever. But again, like, why would you be tied to a particular place? Like, what would cause that? Why wouldn't you be able to move from that location? Or would you be able to move? Like, what would cause those associations to manifest? I don't know. So I can't really see a basis for it, I guess.
I mean, my only thought is maybe like if upon death we retained some kind of knowledge of a previous life. I don't know. Maybe there's a place that you're particularly drawn to and you keep returning to that place every now and then, or perhaps it's the dwelling of your family and so you return there just to like check in, I guess, on them. Not a spirit, don't know what you do as a spirit. Like maybe in that case, it would be kind of a genius look. I sort of like also not really. That's kind of the only thing I can think of is maybe just a place where one continuously returns, or maybe like a selection, like all of your ancestors return to this one place because like that's where you are, right? You could maybe consider that to be like a genius loci of sorts. I don't know though. Then you have things like I'm thinking of like Gettysburg, right? So there was the war that happened in Gettysburg, and a lot of people, like I recall when I went there, I definitely felt the presence of something else. Like it was pretty intense. Yeah, I cried. It was intense. And so then it's like, is the intensity of that feeling maybe because I don't want to use the word haunted, but like it's maybe it's a place that is a genius loci for maybe soldiers who fought in that particular war, or is it just heavy from other reasons? I don't know. I don't know. I am tempted to say no, but I do think that maybe a large gathering of spirits at one particular region, you could consider it to be a genius loci, and in that case, yes, but there's a reason. Like, does that make sense?
It does, yeah. I think that a genius loci has to actually embody part of a place. So that's
Yeah, that's
my
fair.
dispute on that. So, but then again, I guess you could say maybe the cultural history of what you were describing could embody it. I don't know.
Yeah,
I
like
could go
like
either way.
Gettysburg is like it's like a place where the war happened and like people were fallen, right? So like in that case, like maybe that's a better example where that could maybe fit in. But even then, like I've still it doesn't quite fit like what a genius loci like really is.
Yeah, I personally, I definitely have had similar experiences at Gettysburg. I mean, a lot of people have. God, I once got lost in Like, we were following the GPS. It was the middle of the night. We got lost, and a massive fog rolled over the battlefields, and we realized we were
Ooh,
lost in the
creepy.
battlefield. It was the worst. But anyway, I made it out alive. I don't think that's a genius loci, though. I don't believe places, or I don't see places where like tragedy has occurred. I don't really see that as like those are like, I mean, I have a very specific view of like ghosts and memory. I believe a lot of ghosts are just like memory embodied. So I would kind of view that as like the memory slash ghosts, but not necessarily the genius loci. I don't think that it's necessarily the memory of a place. I think the genius loci is like alive and present. And I think that there might be aspects of that culture that have touched it, but I would not necessarily see it as like it only not that it, yeah, I would say that it predominantly is like the current spirit of the place rather than like the historical spirit of a place, if that makes sense. Like I think the genius loci adapts and grows with the place that it is in. And there might be aspects of that memory within it, but I don't think that it is primarily made up of ghosts or memory, if that makes sense. I think it's defined by the culture of whoever is currently there.
Yeah, that's a good point. Mhm.
Yeah, I think like a really classic example would be like a mountain or something, or
Right.
it's yeah, something that really kind of embodies the region that you're in, um, and kind of feels like it's present, ever present everywhere around you, and it's kind of the spirit of that region, not a spirit inhabiting that region. I think that's the key difference for me, but I guess it's quite hard to articulate.
So like, okay, if we're looking at like nymphs, for example, so nymphs are like very much like aspects of the land. They inhabit trees, inhabit rivers or waterways. But I view them as being like free and mobile. Like they can move. They don't really necessarily, I don't think they stray too far out of a place, but I think they're sort of more immediate, more not tangible. Obviously they're intangible. But I view them as more like immediate communicate with, or like people do divination with nymphs. People worship them. The genius loci, I kind of almost imagine it like the climate of an area. Not like the literal climate, but something that stays within the area, is defined by the area and shifts and changes. So it's like something that's far more steady, I guess. If nymphs are like birds that are like running around, the genius loci is almost like the clouds or the air, the sky, like these bigger, less mobile aspects. Now you can like work with the genius loci, I suppose, and like make offerings, but it's like this thing that moves through people and through the place and is not necessarily embodied by one thing. I just went way off the deep. I usually don't go super deep off the off the deep end with philosophy, but that's how I view the genius loci. As it's like the genius loci of downtown Boston. It's like this energy that you can just feel when you're there, and it moves through people, it moves through places, and it's just something that is so. You go there and you're like, oh, I know exactly where I am, or like Lil Italy in Boston. That place has the strongest genius loci I've ever like seen, because it is so defined by the people that live there, and it's palpable. But it's not something that I can just do divination with the genius loci exactly, because I don't really see it as one thing. It's more like this spiritual or spirit.
I agree with you, and I think that this is a really good jumping off point for our next question. Are there urban genius loci of train stations? Can you work with them? Are there guardians, the pigeons that reside within? And reside actually has a French accent, so I think it's réside. No, let's skip that.
My phone autocorrects things to have accents on them. Yeah, so I think when I wrote that, I was also thinking about nymphs as well, and not just genius loci. I mean, I personally, as like a city dweller, I think that there is definitely something to like urban divinity or urban supernatural things. Like, I don't think it's limited to just parts of nature, because I think, wherever humans are, we bring our nonsense with us. We bring our energy with us, whatever the quote energy is. We bring our spirituality with us. I don't know, that was just a thought I had because I was waiting for the train and it was late. I was thinking, like, can you appease the like spirits of the train station?
I did see a meme one time that showed an altar to Mercury
Yes, I
in a
saw
train
that one.
station, like a substation, and I was like, that's fucking brilliant. Whoever did that, like, I want to be your friend.
I know, I saw that too. I have had that thought so many times. It would just get taken down by
It would totally get taken down,
yeah.
but like, I would put it back up.
Yeah, that's like not a bad idea. Yeah, I mean, I think there are spirits of urban places, like, genius loci specifically. People often talk about them being in natural places, but I think they're everywhere because, I mean, I just gave that whole example about like the North End, the Little Italy in Boston. It's very palpable, like very much like a presence. And in terms of in train stations, though, because I feel like where I get hung up with the genius loci in particular is like, how big or how small is it? People have talked about genius loci of entire regions, and then there's also the like land spirits of like a single corner of a field. So I think that is where I get hung up of where does one genius loci begin and the other end. I don't see why there wouldn't be like nymphs or spirits. Well, nymphs maybe not, but spirits, some sort of land spirit of a train station. Sure. I'm gonna start communing with the pigeons. But in terms of a genius loci, I don't know. Like, maybe if there was like one particular train car, maybe there's like one that's like, yeah, this one's definitely got something here. But I ultimately, I don't know if it would just be a greater part of the city's genius loci. I don't know.
I think they're very liminal spaces.
Yeah.
First of all, because of the really obvious relationship to kind of transitions. The first thing that sprang to mind is the London Tube for me, and how you mentioned singular train cars. I could think of individual lines. They all have very, very specific energies. Like if you teleported me right now to a random tube car, and I was not allowed to look at the map, I bet I could tell you which line I was on, because they just have that specific feeling to them. Some of them were built hundreds of years ago. Some of them are much newer. So some of them are kind of dingier, dirtier, louder. All of those things have a really profound effect on your mentality and your feeling when you're there. And yeah, I think I would argue that there's kind of an embodiment there, which I think strays into the territory of genius loci. But how you would begin to work with that, I do not know. I think that's where I kind of get stuck.
That's interesting now that you say that, because I was thinking about how me and my housemates, we described each of Boston's subways as different types of horror media. And like, which one's the Twilight Zone? Which one's Welcome to Night Vale? Which one's the Magnus Archives? Like, and we were able to define pretty much unanimously, like, which line, and like, we're like, oh, this line has this energy, this line has this energy. So that's actually very interesting, because definitely we very much, I was thinking about if I close my eyes, you put me, like, I wasn't allowed to like look at the physical train car. If you close my eyes, I wonder if I'd be able to tell what line I was on just based on the presence of it. Like, there's definitely lines or particular stations that are just like there's one particular station where I will literally like mutter. I have a charm in my wallet because I'm like, this place is cursed. And like I like mutter blessings to myself as I walk off. I was like, oh, this place is super cursed all times of day. There actually might be something to that. But again, I'm not sure how much one can work individually with a genius loci versus like other types of land spirits. Maybe one could work with certain spirits of that place, literal like land spirits, and like offer them something. I don't know. But I don't know if you could actually work with the genius loci.
I don't know, you could work with the rats of a train station.
You could work with the pigeons. That's what I'm saying. Get the pigeons.
I don't have anything bad, so.
I don't know. It's a very interesting thought.
Just me and Fel on like a wild one.
Yeah,
go for it. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so kind of along similar lines, sort of. Can you work with stuff in the museum? I have to admit, when I saw this, my mind immediately went to, what is it, Night at the Museum, where everything comes to life, and yeah. I was like, yeah, like, you could do it like that. No. That's one of those things where, Phil, you mentioned something earlier about, like, working with the memory of something, and that's kind of what you think the ghosts are, but I also think that you can work with memory in kind of a very literal way. And in that case, I think you'd be working more with like the memory of historical events more than anything like specifically material. It's interesting actually, because when I was in Washington, D.C. for a trip like a long time ago, I went to the Holocaust Museum. And when you're there, one of the things that you can do is you can walk through the train car. I mean, I'd be like, there's palpable energy in that train car. And it is like really, really intense. It's one of those things where like I did it once and I will never do it again. Like it kind of scarred me a little bit. And in that case, like it's more the memory of what happened, but it's like the memory as provided to you by the people who inhabited the train car. It's more of like go to a museum and like honoring the memory of something.
That's a very good point. I mean, like when I went to Prague, I accidentally got trapped in the medieval torture chamber that they have beneath the because there's only one way in and one way out.
How did you do that?
Well, because there's only one way in and one way out, and people kept coming in, and I was like, let me out of here. There was like definitely there is definitely like something to places that are so old and as intense as those areas. Like that whole castle was like, whoa, there was like there were so many things that had happened there. I mean, like I work in historic parts of New England, and there's palpable energy every day that I work there. Specifically where I work was where like a lot of the beginnings and a lot of the main parts of the American Revolution happened. So like there definitely is something there. And like sometimes I'll literally sit in one of the pews that of the church, the historic church that I work at, and I'll just like close my eyes, and there's definitely something, and it stands out against like the greater genius loci of that part of Boston, because it's very distinct and very prominent and very old. It was kind of like Gettysburg, like we mentioned. Mm-hmm. Gettysburg has like a very distinct kind of energy. But how that translates to museums, I'm not sure. Because I personally, when I've gone to museums, like while I love the historical aspects and I'm always like blown away and I'm like, wow, this is like a real life, like this is like a real life Greek statue. But I don't necessarily feel a spiritual connection beyond what I like know. So like places like when I visited Ellis Island, I remember getting really emotional at Ellis Island because it's a very intense place. Like also when you go there as a kid, they'll have you do things like go through things that the immigrants in Ellis Island used to go through. So that's another aspect where you're like, oh God. But that's the place specifically. Whereas a museum, I'm just thinking like your standard museum of art or history museum, where it's divorced from the place that those things are originally from. I'm not sure if you can really work with those things. Now, this is interesting because the museum near me is actually building a replica Greek temple. Yeah, it's very cool. They've been working on it for like 2 years now. It's going to open this fall, and I'm very excited to go. And like they actually already have like a replica, I think it's Egyptian, I think. But they already have like a replica little temple in there that they used actual stones. And there is something when I walk into that little corner of the museum where they like have it sort of sealed off. It feels like a sacred space because of the way that it is sealed off and set up how it was supposed to be set up. But when it's just like I'm looking at a statue that's like under museum lighting and there's big museum windows, there's not as much a connection that I feel. And like I've felt connection to specific objects before. Like I could collect old books. But I think there's something where it's like I am personally like holding this item and there's an energy exchange happening there, whereas I'm not sure if that happens in museums. I don't know.
You bring up a really interesting point of differentiating like an art museum from a place that holds real history, and you can clearly feel like a difference. Like I was just thinking, we had a really beautiful art museum back home, and I'm thinking about the numerous times that I've gone there and like the connections that I had to that place versus the connections that I felt like when I went to the 9/11 memorial in New York. And like it was different. It was almost like the 9/11 memorial. Like, oh my God, I was so fucking emotional. I cried like every 2 seconds. And it was one of those things where like they also had pieces of steel like from the towers that were in the museum that you could like touch. And when I touched that steel bar, I totally lost it. But like that's a very different feeling from like the museum back home, which more has like personal associations with it more than any kind of like historical memory that like would make it have any kind of like specific energy that you could do something with.
It's actually really interesting that you bring that up because we don't. Well, when you have art in a museum, we don't have art museums. We call them galleries, like they're separate entities. So I'm just kind of interested the differentiation.
Well, there are
around
galleries within the art museum.
Yeah, it's strange. But yeah, I was just thinking like if I could work with any spirit in a museum, it would be Dippy in the Natural History Museum, who is a 21-meter diplodocus. It was amazing. But I did kind of have an embarrassing story from when I was in my undergraduate. Doing my undergraduate degree, I did doxing myself slightly here, but I did my undergraduate degree right next door to the British Museum. And as you probably know, England colonized many, many, many countries and stole lots of artifacts. So it actually has a really great, albeit stolen, room full of Greek artifacts, statues, tablets, all sorts of things. And so what I used to do was I would go into Gordon Square and I'd do my kernips and I'd wash my hands there, and then I'd go to the British Museum and I would go and quietly say my prayers, usually in my head, in a museum, because it would be somewhere in the middle of a city, because London is very, very busy. It's not really somewhere you get a lot of privacy, somewhere where I could feel connected. So although I wouldn't necessarily call that working with a spirit, because to me it just felt like somewhere where I could kind of get to the more of a religious connection, devotional connection, it's kind of adjacent, I think. Working with specific objects, though, I think you're kind of limited because you only have fragments, right? So you're also very limited by the interpretation of the historian. So you have maybe a fragment of a tablet, and somebody has told you something about this tablet, but you don't really have the personal connections that the individual who made the tablet has. And I think that would be a limiting factor because you're maybe not able to connect with it in the way that it originally was intended. But maybe I'm misinterpreting that. I'm not sure.
I mean, I think that's true because like I have family from India, so I'm part Indian though. Don't look like that. Don't look like it, but I am. And when I go to sections in museums that like are related to kind of Asian Indian culture and history, like I do feel a personal connection because it's like a familial thing. And I understand the culture and I've participated in the culture and it's been a big part of my life growing up. But if I were to go to like another gallery that contained maybe objects from South American culture, like I wouldn't connect as much to those because I don't have that personal history with it, right? So I do think that definitely plays a factor in terms of your connection and what you could do with something that you see in a museum. Yeah, for sure.
Also, the British Museum should give everything back. just having that on the record here, like it's full of stolen stuff and it's quite bad.
It's interesting because like I was saying earlier, I don't really see museum, like I connect with things in museums sometimes, but it's not usually in a spiritual way, which is interesting. Like I connect with it more in just like a personal level. Like when I look at like fun 18th century clothes, I'm just like, yes, I love it. But like I don't feel any sort of spiritual connection to it. I almost feel more of a spiritual connection if I'm making my own 18th century clothes versus like seeing an actual one that was like worn by someone. Like I have a very unique relationship with the place that I work. And not only because like that place is important, but also because like I am now a part of its legacy. So everything inside of it becomes more important on a spiritual level.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And actually, in the example I gave when I was kind of going to the British Museum, it was almost as much about the ritual of going there. Like it was really conveniently close to university for me, so it would be like part of my routine and part of, kind of, I guess, like regular practice. So I think it was just as much about that as about the objects and the environment itself.
We'll call it on that one. Man, this episode got really philosophical, and I don't think we intended for that to happen. Okay, if nobody has any more thoughts on that, we will kind of close this out as we are reaching our time limit. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. And just as a reminder, we do have a YouTube channel. If you have not found us and subscribed, please do so. We will include a link in the episode description if you would like to listen there. I believe, Fel, there's like, we're up to the 10th episode, I think, there.
Yeah. I'll get, get around to the
we'll,
others.
we'll upload more as we get to it. You can also follow us on Instagram, especially for these episodes. If you have spiritual shower thoughts that you would like us to address, please answer our like story questions that we put out there, and you might see yourself featured in one of these. Great. Thanks for listening, everybody. We will see you next week.